Okay, welcome everybody to the Ojai Valley Lodge, our study of theosophy and world religions. And tonight, the first week in April, we are starting our month-long study of Islam. Tonight, we have Ayat Agah visiting us. Thank you, Faye Ellen. I appreciate the energy that you put forth to get this going. And Ayat, thank you so much for being here. And if you would go ahead and introduce yourself and then take it away.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Thank you for having me. I'll greet you with the common greeting among Muslims, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. The response to that would be wa alaikum salam, and peace be upon you. So just a little bit about myself. I grew up in Northern Virginia. I have been living in California since 2007. My father is from Iran. My mother is a white lady from New Jersey. Her family is Irish and German. She actually grew up Catholic and found her way to Islam as an adult. My siblings and I am one of 5. We were all raised Muslim. And at some point, I can say I consciously made the decision to stay within the faith, that I found it to be something of value, and it's part of what drove my pursuit of a degree in religion. I did my master's in religious studies at Hartford Seminary and continued on in women's studies and religion at Claremont Graduate University.
Can you mention what your work was on? Yeah.
Sure. So my master's thesis was on the soul, the nature of the soul in Islam. And what I wrote about was, has been written on before, as far as the soul being both a feminine and masculine nature. And I argued that for gaining proximity to the creator, the soul should be mostly feminine, and that we would strive to develop that. And my dissertation research and what I'm writing on is on the concept of guardianship within Islam, and how that has been historically applied, both in terms of things like family relationships, as well as in terms of broader applications, specifically in terms of setting up governments around the idea of who holds guardianship over the religious community.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Should I go ahead and get started?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I want to share with all of you, and I'm hoping that it's not too long and that we'll have an opportunity for conversation. And by all means, at any point, please interject with questions if you have them. If I skim over, a term too quickly and you'd like me to pause and say a bit more, and then I would like to have time to be in dialogue with all of you. So I'll go ahead and start my slideshow. So what I wanted to talk with you, I'm going to go back to this real quick, was speaking about Islam. And of course, there are so many different angles that we can approach this topic from, but mostly in terms of, since I was asked to speak about practice, I wanted to think about practice as a means of developing the soul. And I'll start just by locating Islam for us historically. So revelation to the prophet began in 610. The community moved because of persecution in 622 from Mecca to Medina, and this marks the calendar for Muslims, the lunar calendar. And 632 was the death of the prophet and what we would see as the first split within the Muslim community. So what are we talking about when we talk about Islam? Very basically, it's one of the world's monotheistic traditions. And when we use terms like religion and tradition, oftentimes it feels diminutive because it's not just a set of rituals, a set of practices, but really a way of life and something that gives shape to every dimension of our earthly existence. I also always like to point out that Islam is not a monolith. So it's very, very likely that certain things that I'll share with you tonight, other Muslims would think of differently, would profess differently. And there is no one way of interpreting and practicing Islam. And to that end, it is also not something that acts on its own. So we can always dig into Islam by looking at its scripture, but so often what we are seeing when we talk about Islam is in how it is lived. And in the same way that we can think of any tradition, any way of professing, that manifestation will be different depending on who it is that is claiming that identity. So when we're talking about being Muslim and Islam, I think it's helpful to start at the very beginning and look at what these words themselves mean. And both Islam and Muslim come from the root salama. You can see the 3 letters there in Arabic, sin, lam, mim. The equivalent in English would be SLM. And basically this means to be at peace. And specifically, we're talking about being at peace with the will of God. And so here right away, we can bring in our theme of developing the soul, because we understand that in this worldly existence, there is a separation between us and the Creator. And everything that we do would hopefully lessen that separation, decrease it. And with the idea that we will ultimately be returning to our Creator. And the way that we do that is by striving to be at peace with our Creator, or submitting to our Creator. Part of that, a significant part of that, is our intention. So everything that we do should ultimately have the intention of pleasing Allah. And that's what matters. You could even argue to the point that if you intend to carry out something, but it doesn't happen, it's your intention that counts. Assuming we're talking about something that is good and not something, for example, that would cause anybody harm. And all of our actions, for all of our actions, we are accountable to Allah, both in this world and the next. And our conversation about the next world could be, many sessions on its own, as far as what that means. There's ideas of heaven and hell and the separation of the physical from the soul, but we won't go into that too much right now. And connected to our aim of being at peace with Allah is our mindfulness around our covenant with Allah. And we can find this covenant spelled out specifically in the Qur'an, in this narration around creation. And in this moment, all of creation is brought forth and asked by Allah, am I not your Rab, your creator, your sustainer, your nourisher? And according to the verse in the Quran, everyone says yes. So that's that promise, that's that covenant right there of entering into this relationship with Allah. Oops. So what does practice look like? These 5 terms here are very often described as the 5 pillars of Islam. And really what they are the 5, you could say, central ways in which Muslims practice their faith. Ahead, I think, paramount to any form of practice, we have this verse from the Qur'an as guidance that ultimately, no matter how much we pray, profess our belief in God, fast, perform the Hajj, give zakat, which is charity, ultimately what is the most important and how we are measured in relationship to God is in our mindfulness of God, in our awareness of God, and that would be what guides all of our actions. To dig into these practices a little bit, the Shahada is basically the testament of faith for Muslims. So this is declaring that Allah is the one and only creator, and that the Prophet Muhammad is his messenger. One of the most common practices is the daily prayer, and this is performed 5 times a day. And one thing that stands out to me in terms of prayer and this practice and other practices, as we'll discuss in a minute, is how embodied they are. So we have this physical self that exists in this world, and we have this soul that is striving to become closer to Allah, and our physical self is a means for doing that. So in our bowing, our prostrating, the motions that we go through as we pray, all of those are instruments of developing this relationship with Allah, ways of showing our devotion to the Creator. Fasting is also another form of worship that very much involves the body, and we're actually coming up on the month of Ramadan. I think the first day is going to be April 13th this year, and Ramadan moves up about 10 days in the Gregorian calendar because it's on the lunar cycle. And here too, here's a month where basically we're very intentionally putting our body second and reorienting our focus to our soul and placing an emphasis on our spiritual development, our spiritual growth. Hajj is the pilgrimage that Muslims are encouraged to take at least once in their lifetime. And this is the pilgrimage to Mecca, and the Kaaba in Mecca, and I have a brief clip for us to watch in a little bit, is the location, the geographic location that all Muslims turn to face wherever they are, wherever they might be in the world. And here too, you can think about that physical act that physically, literally orients you in a particular direction as a reminder of how your life should be oriented, that everything that you do is oriented towards your Creator, with your intention of pleasing your Creator. And this spills out into all of our daily interactions with people, how we carry ourselves and conduct ourselves and treat others and treat the environment, and every facet of your life that you could imagine. All of these practices are geared to discipline ourselves to that orientation, again, of submitting ourselves to Allah. And finally, zakat, and this is the giving of charity, and every Muslim has this obligation of, when they have the means to do so, after they've taken care of all of their family obligations financially, then they give a small portion of what is left in charity. And you also find among the traditions narrated and attributed to the prophet that an act of charity could even be something as seemingly simple as offering a smile. So again, that, within your means. And this idea of like doing what you can within your means, one thing I want to point out with all of these practices, especially when they entail physical movement, that there is no, nothing is lost for those who can't carry out the physical actions the way that somebody else might. So if somebody can't bow and prostrate the way another person would during prayer, they can perform their prayer seated and in whatever fashion they're able to do. Same thing with fasting, that if physical harm would come to you by fasting, then you can modify your fast or skip the fast. That, none of these forms of worship should be a source of hardship for us. So continuing with this notion of how Islam shapes one's life, I've mentioned briefly the lunar calendar that Islam rotates around. And within that calendar, there are particular days that are considered like special days of prayer, of reflection. There are days that mark the births and deaths of the prophet and his family that are observed. And these days have particular supplications that Muslims might recite during these days, or if they're able, make pilgrimages to places where the prophet and his family members are buried. The times of prayer give a structure to our day. So the first prayer is before the sun rises, and then there's 2 daytime prayers, the evening prayer that follows the sunset, and then a later nighttime prayer that follows. There are also other times of prayer in the middle of the night. There are also prayers that are performed on the occasion, for example, when somebody passes away, when somebody wants to pray for something in particular. So other prayers that, on top of the 5 daily prayers. And then also with this, I wanted to share, this is one example of a verse from the Qur'an that I thought was tied to how our physical selves and the world around us can help us reflect on our spiritual selves. So this is just a very basic example, a verse from the Qur'an that mentions, do you not realize that everything in the heavens and earth submits to God? The sun, the moons, the stars, the mountains, the trees, and the animals. So if we stop for a second and think about the ayat of Qur'an, this is actually where my name comes from. Every single verse in the Qur'an is an ayah, the plural being ayat. And these are signs. And that's what ayah means, a sign of God. And all of these things in nature are likewise signs of God for the believer to reflect on. Now I do have a brief clip to share with you, and I'm hoping I might need to stop sharing and share again to make sure that you get the sound. So bear with me while I do that.
Mecca sits in the western mountains of Saudi Arabia, in a sanctuary roughly 100 miles square. Since long before Islam, it has been considered sacred territory, where no one could hunt, cut trees or fight. At the heart of the city is a great mosque called Al-Masjid Al-Haram, and at its center is the Kaaba. Muslims don't worship the Kaaba. They worship what it represents, the one God. Hajj takes place in and around Mecca. It is a series of rituals performed between the 8th and 13th days of the last month of the Islamic calendar. While circling the Kaaba is the final act of the pilgrimage, it is also the top priority for pilgrims when they first get to Mecca. For Muslims who have prayed in this direction every day for years, seeing the Kaaba for the first time is almost overwhelming. Now to the Valley of Mina, where the Prophet Muhammad stopped and rested on his Hajj nearly 14 centuries ago. This is a town that grows from virtually 0 to 2 million people overnight. At dawn on the next day, the camps stir with anticipation for the greatest day of the Hajj. 2 million people are off to the plain of Arafat. Some 50,000 vehicles clog the roads. Arafat is 8 miles east of Mina. It's the place, Muslims believe, Adam and Eve found each other after exile from Eden. And it's seen by many as a rehearsal for the Day of Judgment.
It's Judgment Day. All the trappings of life sort of fall away and you see these people in front of God Almighty. And that's all there is.
A strange quiet descends in the afternoon as people turn inward. It's called the Standing at Arafat. Only when the sun has set can pilgrims leave Arafat. Nearly 2 million people stand poised to move as soon as the sun dips below the horizon. The pilgrims move back toward the white tents of Mina, where tomorrow they will engage in a symbolic battle with the devil. Here, Muslims believe, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, but the devil challenged him not to. One story says, Abraham pelted the devil with stones 3 separate times, chasing him away. 3 stone pillars mark the spots where Abraham stood his ground. At a place called Muzdalifa, on the way to the pillars, pilgrims pick up pebbles to stone Satan themselves. The ritual is called the Jumrat. With all other rites complete, pilgrims return to Mecca for a grand parting visit. They have all earned an honorific title, Haji for the men, Hajjah for the women. Pilgrims arrive alone in a current of 1 million strangers and go home riding a spiritual wave of rebirth.
So one thing I want to point out from that video, if you'd noticed, the men in particular are wearing very simple attire. It essentially is made up of 2 pieces of fabric that they drape around themselves across their top and then tie around their waist. And part of that has to do with marking, with reminding us that we are more than just this physical self, and also so that there is no way to differentiate between ourselves, that whatever your class, whatever your station in society, whatever your earthly role, here in this place, in the house of God, we are all one. And that too is very much tied to the soul and the recognition that we are all from one soul. And these 2 verses from the Qur'an remind us that that we are from Allah, and to Allah we will return. So the verses read, surely we shall try you with something of fear and hunger, and loss of wealth and lives and crops, but give glad tidings to the steadfast, who say, when a misfortune strikes them, lo, we are Allah's, and lo, unto him we are returning. So this last phrase, for example, is something that when you receive the news of someone who has passed away, this is something that you would say in recognition of this life coming to an end, and that person's existence moving into another realm of existence, and that a reminder of where we came from, and that when we think about where it is we came from, that is what unites us to one another, and would be part of that promise that we made to Allah as adorers of Allah, that we would be respectful and cognizant of how we treat one another because of the connection that we have to that single nafs, that single soul that we all came from. So that's it for my presentation. And I'll open it up to all of you if anyone would like to ask a question or present anything that you'd like to share with all of us.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, so just start. Anybody have a question? Jerry.
First of all, thank you so much for doing this. This is both brave of you on the one hand and wonderful on the other hand, because all of us are intensely interested to understand the various traditions of the world and to respect them. And I think what you told us went a long ways towards making it easy to be respectful of this tradition.
Thank you.
And you did it so clearly too. That was very wonderful. The subject that you studied in college and wrote your dissertation, I'm particularly interested in that. The idea of soul is a kind of a universal concept in all the religious traditions, I think. And I think it's fair to say that, at least in conventional thinking, it's vague. It's kind of, in the minds of most human beings, I think it's a vague idea. In your studies of Islam, what definition, what way would you characterize the concept of the soul from the Islamic point of view?
That's an excellent question, and thank you very much for your kind words at the beginning there. So the soul in Islam, if we look at the language of the Qur'an, and I mentioned this right at the end, the term is nafs, and this is the word used to talk about, there's a verse in the Qur'an that says, we made you from a single soul and from it its pair. And right away, this is used, for example, by feminist scholars of Islam who want to make the case that there should be no gender disparity when it comes to Islam, because men and women were all made from this single nafs. And then when we try to understand what that actually means, are we talking about like an energy, something that is tangible or not, that exists separate from this physical self that we have? And there's definitely a lot of scholarship here that we don't have time to get into right now. But one of the ways that the nafs is spoken of is there are different terms applied to it that describe almost, if you will, its state, the state of the soul, specifically as one exists in this world. And nafsan mutma'inna, the assured nafs, the secure nafs, is the ultimate state where there's a definite not just an understanding, but like an embodiment of what it means to be from this nafs that came from this creator, that you would know, that you would trust, that you would live in that trust that whatever happens to you in this world is meant to happen, that you would not fear, that you would not, feel anxious about things that come to you, the same way that verse says that, even in hardship, we would recall that we are from Allah and to Allah we will return. Other ways that, to touch briefly on the research that I did for my master's thesis, other ways to talk about the soul. In English, we use feminine and masculine, but one of the conversations that happens around the soul uses the categories that are used to classify the attributes of God. So you may have heard about the 99 names of God. And these names or these attributes, and there's actually more than 99, are categorized as the beautiful, the Jamal, or the mighty, the Jalal. And so the soul has been written about as taking on these two characteristics as well. There's a fascinating book by Sachiko Murata, who compares ideas of the soul within Islam to Taoism and the concept of the yin and yang. And so that there would be a balance of the Jalal and Jamal in the perfected soul. And that was where I wrote about that. No, I think there needs to be a predominance of the Jamal, the beautiful or the feminine within the soul, for it to be at its most close relationship to the divine.
Hello, this is Robert Elwood. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good. Yeah, I'd just like to make a couple of comments on Islam and theosophy, at least as I understand it. First of all, the oneness of Allah, of God, reminds one very much of the emphasis on oneness in theosophy, particularly in the mystical traditions of Islam. The oneness of God is seen as in and through all things. That is sort of the fundamental reality. And this is, I think, very important and very congenial to the theosophical outlook. Secondly, the idea of the Rasul, or prophet. Well, the idea of Muhammad as the seal of the prophets, the final and greatest one, may be distinctive to Islam. There is a tradition of many other prophets leading up to Muhammad, from Abraham and Moses on down to Jesus, who is considered the greatest and next before the prophet Muhammad. And also there is a tradition of prophets or Rasuls in many different cultures who teach the traditional wisdom in a language that is appropriate to that particular culture. And this also reminds me very much of the theosophical emphasis on prophets throughout all of the traditions of the world, who convey the ancient wisdom in ways appropriate to their time and place, and are really the same as what theosophy would call masters or Mahatmas, great souls. So I think there is a particularly interesting convergence between Islam and theosophy in this respect also.
Thank you for that. Yes. And you're absolutely right that especially the recognition of prophets, rasuls, messengers goes a long way in reminding us of that connectivity that we all have to one another. And the idea within Islam is that Allah would not have created people and not offered them a form of guidance. And so the Qur'an, for example, very explicitly recognizes the prophethood of Jesus, the prophethood of Moses, and recognizes books of revelation that came before the Qur'an. and that there are these other forms of communication between the divine and humans as a source of guidance for how, specifically for how to live in this world and strive for the next. Thank you.
In one of the early quotes you showed, I think that it said, "We created the world." Who is that we? Who was talking there?
That's a great question. When you look through the chapters of the Qur'an, the references to God have a mixture of pronouns. So most commonly, it's the masculine pronoun to refer to God, but then there's also this we language. One of the, and this isn't my specialty, so I'll have to defer to the experts, but one of the ways that that's explained is almost, if you would, like the royal we. Another way that it's spoken of is keeping in mind that ultimately it is only Allah who is singularly the creator of all, but that it perhaps points to those within the divine realm. So those with the most proximity to Allah, who I don't want to say are credited with creation, but play a significant role in creation, and specifically in guiding creation. And if we were to put a name to it, it would be the prophet and his family, who are considered to be the most proximate to Allah.
I think it's also the case that in James' Bible, sometimes it speaks of himself plural as we, is considered kind of the divine plural mention. In fact, one word that is used in the Bible in Hebrew is Elohim, which is technically a plural, but it's usually translated as Lord. And so you can interpret that however you want to, but it's certainly not. It certainly is the case that although there is but one God, sometimes the plural pronouns are used for him for whatever reason.
Yeah, I was going to mention that in the Bible, in the Hebrew, part of the Bible, Elohim is also plural.
Yeah.
Sometimes in theosophy, for example, Blavatsky, who was one of the main teachers, she would say that the ultimate God is like the sustainer of everything, but then she would say that it's like the architect, where the divine ideas are, but then the actual masons were angels. So the creative forces, she would say, are these emanations from the highest deity, and the highest deity is even beyond the act of creation, because it's the sustainer of everything.
Right.
That's beautiful.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, Dad. Hi, Ayat. Thank you for doing this. I have the privilege of having gone to graduate school with Ayat, so you can see what a gift she is. I'm interested in the what you said, that prayer about like this happens to you for a reason, or that statement about it, and that sounds at once comforting and troubling. And I was wondering in your experience or the history of Islam, if that's sort of been, abused, or I don't know. I just was interested in more on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, that's something that I've wondered a lot about myself, especially when we look at, people who are going through suffering and hardship. And I think it's very easy as humans to wonder, like, does that mean God is cruel and God would be okay with humans suffering? And I think instead that, and yes, there's definitely scholarship around this, but I think instead of thinking about, well, let me take a step back. One thing that there's a scholar, Asma Barlas, who writes on gender in Islam, and one of the ways in which she makes the case that there cannot, like, oppression towards women is not permissible because God does not oppress, and so other human beings are not permitted to oppress, and the term specifically is dhulm. So you can't commit dhulm, oppression, like harm to other beings. So the idea there is that God doesn't cause hardship for you, but one of the ways that I try and make sense of it is that there are circumstances in the world and decisions that, let's say, others make that would lead to hardship. So let's be specific and talk about poverty. There are systems that allow for and perhaps even create, this economic structure where there are people who end up living in poverty while others live lavish lives. And so people who are experiencing hardship in that, it's not so much because God wants them to experience that hardship, but these systems allow for it. And for those who are experiencing that hardship, there is something to be gained. There is in trusting that ultimately it is God who is taking care of them. Patience through those circumstances are the reminder and are what would bring ease from that hardship. I'm reminded now of another verse in the Qur'an that says that after every hardship there is ease. So every time that we experience something that we would talk about as painful, there is something to be learned from there. There is a way in which it helps us to grow as a person. And so that forbearance through that experience is what we would be called to observe, the patience through that experience. I hope that answered your question.
That's really helpful and interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
I did I looked for some quotes in Theosophy over the weekend about Easter and what it means. And in one of the quotes I found, it said, no cross, no crown, which means that if we don't bear our crosses, there is no crown of glory afterwards. And I just, it goes, we hear no pain, no gain,
right,
type stuff all the time. And we have no problem accepting that.
Yeah.
But to hear it on this deeper level.
Yeah. And you reminded me, thank you for that. You reminded me that that idea of like the pain or the cross that we might bear. There's another verse in the Qur'an that reminds us that no one would be asked to carry a burden that they wouldn't be capable to carry. Yeah.
So touching on karma and reincarnation,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of, the verses that you can read in any religion, tie it back or tie it to that. Is there anything more pointed about those subjects in the Quran?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think you would find that the most mainstream viewpoint from within Islam about reincarnation is that the idea of, like me existing as Ayat right now, dying and then coming back as somebody else. The most mainstream perspective on that is that it doesn't happen, that Ayat dies, my soul will one day be brought forth, rise up before God to stand in judgment, but I don't come back as another being, and certainly would not come back in another form, another non-human form. I'm not too aware of scholarship that offers a different take on that. Most of what I've read is attempts to try and understand what that means when we talk about this physical body dying and the soul moving into another realm, because there's also this idea of a barzakh, of an in-between this world and what it will look like on that day of judgment, that day of resurrection, and that's and then what comes from there is like heaven and hell, and there too is obviously like scholarship on what that even means, like because the Qur'an contains these depictions, for example, of heaven as like places with these rivers flowing and you know, food to eat and drink to have, and then hell being like a very nasty place of punishment that you wouldn't want to be in. And there you do definitely have scholars' attempts to try and make sense of that. But yeah, the reincarnation part for the most part is not something that in mainstream Islam is believed in. And I'll also qualify all of that by saying it's really not something that I've really looked into myself. So I'm sure that there's a lot out there that I'm just not aware of.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Gary?
Am I jumping in front of somebody?
No, I don't think.
Does someone else have a question that want to go first?
Nope, jump.
Okay, I'm jumping. I wanted to ask you about because I think Michelle was encouraging you to talk to us about practice, which is such an important topic for all devotees of any tradition. So one of the unique practices that you and Islamic followers engage in is the 5 prayers to Mecca. And I wondered, you know, we have in say like in the Buddhist tradition, we have the idea of mindfulness, which gets kind of superficially bantered about in conventional society, but in its deeper meaning, it seems to have a similarity to something you said earlier, which is the way that a devotee of Islam is measured ultimately is the degree to which the individual keeps in mind, in one's heart, a closeness with God. Am I right about that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So is the 5 prayers intended to be kind of, you might say, chains and a link to try and help the devotee eventually get to the point where that feeling of prayer is perpetual, not just isolated at those 5 periods, but are they kind of like outposts of reminding oneself to keep that attention focused on God?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And if you look at, you know, the way that they're scattered throughout the day, one way to think of that is as a chance to step out of whatever your daily routine is and reconnect. And that, you know, just like you said, if you can get that down, then you can build out and experience those moments of awareness on a regular basis. So, you know, to the point where with every inhale and exhale, there would be that awareness of how those actions are even possible. Or another another practice to prepare oneself to get into that mindset of performing the daily prayers. There's a form of washing that Muslims do that entails washing your face and arms and drawing water over the top of your head and as well as your feet. And so a lot of Muslims, it's common for them to maintain that state of washing throughout the day, and not just for the 5 daily prayers, with the intention. And if you recall, we talked about the significance of intention, but with the intention that everything that you do would be a form of worship. Everything that you do would be something done with an awareness of who it is that is making those actions possible, and who you would be hoping to please through those actions.
In Theosophy, in Madame Blavatsky's diagram of meditation, she talks about a substratum, that through these meditations, through these affirmings and what are the two called? The denials, through things we want to gather, things we want to get rid of, throughout using this, we're creating this substratum from which all our actions can come from. And it sounds very similar.
Yeah, it does. It does.
I have a question, because in Theosophy, there is the idea that the formless is higher than that which is with form. Forms are perishable and limited. So in Islam, there is a lot about not picturing Allah and, you know, the formless aspect of the deity. Do you think that influences the kind of worship? I mean, how does a Muslim think about Allah? Does he or she think like the Christian, a man with beard, or that formlessness keeps it more abstract?
Yeah, so definitely when you look at Islamic art, there should be no depictions of Allah. And the idea definitely is that Allah does not exist within a physical form, and certainly not a human form. Although it's interesting that you do find reference to, for example, the face of God, the hand of God. So how do we make sense of that if God does not have, you know, a hand that looks like this, a face that, you know, would have features like our faces do? And what is the purpose of that language? Is it to provide a sense of familiarity with concepts that we know and understand? But I do think that there is, I do think that that formlessness to God allows for a broader image, if you will, of what it means when we say that God is one. And in that sense, I mean, if our devotion is to God, if the care with which we exist in the world is centered around God, then what else is within that unity of God that we would also extend the same level, or at least a portion of that level of awareness and care and regard for? That this existence that does not take a singular form permeates all of existence around us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Adele, go ahead and unmute yourself. Unless you're talking to yourself, and then that's okay.
Which I have done. That's very similar to the formlessness in Judaism. So I think the two religions have that in common very much. But I also thank you, Ayat, for doing this for us. We're certainly learning a lot from you. I wanted to ask you something which is a little bit outside of theosophy, but still it matters. Um, Within countries that are Muslim, the law of Sharia is prominent, but in communities outside of Muslim countries um, where where the community exists within another structure, like in the West, in America, in England, um, how is this being integrated into the the countries where a Muslim community lives and tries to respect the Muslim law of Sharia? If you could address that.
Sure, thank you. An important question. So let me start by definitions. So Sharia basically means the path. And one way that we understand Sharia is to walk the path that is in keeping with God's will. So how do we even know what that is? And if there are rules to follow so that we are walking that path, where do we find those rules? And I'm blanking on the number right now, but if you were to open the Qur'an and try and find anything that resembles a very specific rule, it's such a small portion compared to the thousands of verses that are within it. So, and for example, like we were just talking about the 5 daily prayers, you can't find in the Qur'an how to do the 5 daily prayers, what that looks like. So you have to look to other sources. So immediately you would look to the prophet, and in this case, how the prophet performed prayers. And as part of the attempt to understand what Sharia is, what that path is, we have fiqh, which is F-I-Q-H, typically spelled. And this is where we get into laws. So these are human attempts to write down laws that Muslims should follow so that they're in compliance with Sharia. And these would cover anything from what you should eat. Is it permissible to take out a loan to buy a house because you would be paying interest and Muslims aren't supposed to pay interest? Can you donate your organs? So on and so forth. So many different elements that have to do with our lives. And so yes, you are absolutely right that there are countries that are predominantly Muslim where the government where their governments have attempted to set up civil law that is shaped by religious law. And so for Muslims who don't live in such countries, for example, in the US, you can still abide by fiqh and still, as you know, at the same time, be in compliance with the law of the land, to put it that way. I blanked on the example I was gonna give. Oh, to go back to the interest thing. So in the US, for example, it's very common to take out a mortgage to buy a home. So for a Muslim, if you were to do that, you're not going to find a bank that is going to loan you money and not charge you interest when it's time for you to pay that back. So would you have permission to do that? And Muslim scholars, there are some Muslim scholars who have said that yes, like because you need to have a roof over your head, and especially if you have, a family that you need to provide a house for, it's permissible. Go ahead and take out the loan and pay the interest on it because you need to care for your family. So there are these ways of navigating the disparity between fiqh and the law of the land, or the practice of the land that you're living in. The other thing to mention about fiqh is that it's human made. So who is making these laws? Who is developing them? What context, within what context are they coming out of? Is there a patriarchal slant to them that would, perhaps inconvenience, or to the worst extent, like harm people? Or if we talk about organ donation, that wasn't something that was practiced at the time of the Prophet. So that was something that scholars had to then look at precedents in relation to rules around how do you show respect for the body? How do you use the means that you have to preserve life? And is it permissible to donate organs? And I want to say, for the most part, Muslims believe that it is permissible to do so, but that was something that had to, that developed as technology developed, as society developed, and became a practice for Muslim scholars to respond to.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, it is 8 o'clock or 8:04. Does anybody have any last question that they want to bring forth? Okay, yes, Ananya.
Ayat, thank you so much for your talk tonight. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
We're talking about development of the soul, and I have been reading the Divine Seeds of Love by A. Halwa, which I don't know if you've read it or not. It's a beautiful book, and she talks about the Islamic faith, but just about what it is and how Islam actually means to submit. It's the people of submission. And she was originally a poet, and she wrote this book, and she wrote it in poetry, and they told her, no, you've got to put this in prose. And so she's written this absolutely lovely book. But she's also done very much of, what you've talked about tonight. There are no pictures of her. So she's making sure that there's no physical, attention given to her.
Yeah.
But one of the things that she talks about in that is the fitra. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because your topic tonight is about development of the soul. And I found that it's such a beautiful teaching.
Yeah, thank you for that. The first thing that comes to mind is at the end of the month of Ramadan, Muslims celebrate Eid al-Fitr. And it's connected to that same concept of fitra, that we have within us this, it's the essence of who we are. And so the month of Ramadan specifically is set aside as a time to reconnect with your fitra. And you can think of it as your inner self, your innate self. And what is that self? It's that nafs that is connected to that single nafs that we all are from. It's that nafs that stood before Allah and said, yes, you are my everything. And that, it's that fitra that that the awareness that we strive for of Allah would at the same time mean that we are constantly aware of our fitra as well, and how the ways in which we move in the world, how are we reflecting our fitra, as opposed to, the bad mood that I might be in the moment, and somebody looks at me funny, and then, I lash out at them or something like that. But yeah, it's that inner self would be one way to think of the fitra, and that it's good, that it's beautiful, that it's pure, any of those types of adjectives that you would want to ascribe to it because of its source, because of where it came from.
And in theosophy, I think that we would look at it as our higher self. It's
That's
that,
a beautiful way to put it.
it's that more authenticity and
Yeah,
closer connected to God.
that's perfect. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Faye Ellen, thank you so much for this introduction. We are so blessed to have you here tonight, Ayat, and appreciate the time that you put into the talk. And Robert, thank you for being here tonight. We're always glad to have you here.
Thank you.
All right, here's your time to shower, Ayat, with thank yous, and then I won't attempt. What would be a goodbye greeting? Would you say the same thing?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum would be hello and goodbye. So thank you to all of you.
What hand gesture would go with that?
A very common gesture would be to put your hand over your heart and say assalamu alaikum.
Okay.
If anything, yeah. Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed my time with you and learned a lot from what you shared. Thank you so much.
Very much.
You're so wonderful.
We could use another session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Walaikum salam.
Good night.
Bye, everyone. Good night. Thank you, Michelle.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yes, yes. Good night.